previous session, we spoke about the genre of apocalypse, focusing on Revelation. How should we read it? And in this session, we're going to talk about the background and message of Revelation. And then tomorrow morning, we'll talk about some of the issues of interpretation. Although, as we speak right now, we will already be resolving some of those or creating some questions in your own mind, which is perfectly fine. To begin to understand Revelation, we need to firstly develop an understanding of the genre of apocalypse, which was our previous session, but we also need to appreciate the overall structure of the book of Revelation, and then we need to examine the context of the original recipients. Now, to appreciate the overall structure, that kind of ties in with what I spoke about before. It means to stand back and admire the entire impressionistic image from a distance to see how everything fits and flows together. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, and hopefully some of this will stick in your own mind as you read it in future, that you'll start to recognize some of these things. Firstly, the book of Revelation has also been called the book of sevens. For example, you find the letters to the seven churches, 7 golden lampstands and 7 stars, 7 blazing lamps, the 7 spirits of God, 7 seals. The Lamb has 7 eyes, the red dragon has 7 heads. There's a scarlet beast with 7 heads, and the beast from the sea also has 7 heads. And there are 7 plagues known as the bowls of wrath. There are 7 seals, and it just goes on and on. But 7 is a very dominant number. Then you also encounter 7 blessings in the book of Revelation. Blessed is the one who reads aloud, hears, and keeps the word of this prophecy. Blessed are the dead who die in the world. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Blessed and holy is the one who share in the first resurrection. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. And blessed are those who wash their robes. Then you also find 7 liturgical exclamations of Christ. Liturgical simply means worship. To Jesus be glory and power forever and ever. Jesus is worthy to take the scroll and open the seals. Jesus is the Lamb who was slain. And then it says, to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. And then salvation belongs to the Lamb. Our Lord and Messiah will reign forever and ever. And last, in Revelation 19, the wedding of the Lamb has come. Now you might think 7, this can't just be by accident, and you are entirely correct. The book, as I said at the start, it is a carefully designed hybrid document, and one needs to look at all this and put it together and realize how amazing it is. And like I showed you in the word cloud at the start, it is all about Jesus. It is about the Lamb of God. It's a revelation of Jesus. When we look at the structure of Revelation, and this is something we do with every book in the Bible, we see that there's a prologue and there's a message, or there's a salutation, and etc., like many other books. But the book of Revelation is more complicated. Virtually every single commentary will give a slightly different structure, but most agree that there are these perhaps 4 sections. Revelation 1 to 3, we find the prologue, and we find John's vision, and then the message to the churches, the ones that we are mostly familiar with. Then Revelation 4 to 16, we find the seal, the trumpet, and the bowl judgments. Revelation 17 verse 1 to 21 verse 8, we find the description of the defeat of evil on earth. Then in Revelation 21 verse 9 to 22 verse 21, we finally find the new Jerusalem and an epilogue. Now, this is the one that's easy to understand, but of course it gets more complicated than that, because between the 6th and the 7th seals, we find the 4 angels, an angel from the east, we find the 144,000 and the multitudes in white robes. Then between the 6th and the 7th trumpet, we find the angel with a little scroll and 2 witnesses. Then between the 6th and the 7th bowl, we find 3 impure spirits, and we find Armageddon. Now, these, let's call them interjections, have been the subject of myriad of speculations. And in these classes, there's simply not enough time to try and resolve all of them and explain each of them. Some of them are quite complicated, but some of them, perhaps at the end of these classes, you might realize perhaps they are not. When we view Revelation from a distance, and I want you to look at this image on the screen. In Revelation 4, verse 5, we find a description of lightning, rumblings, and thunder. A few chapters later, earthquake gets added. And then a few chapters later, to earthquake, hailstorms get added. And then suddenly, it seems like it calms down, and we find the roar of rushing water and thunder. And suddenly the intensity increases again, and we again read thunder, earthquake, and hailstorm. And then the intensity drops again, and we find the roar of rushing water and thunder. See, when you stand at a distance and you view it in such a way, you start seeing a flow, you start seeing an ebbing, almost as if it's a musical score. And that's another way of looking at this. It's almost like a symphony being played, and at some point you can hear the cymbals clashing and the violin starting up and percussion, and then there's a quiet period and there's just a flute playing. These are various ways that might assist you as it assists me in appreciating the book and seeing the underlying structure. And this is one that I got from a book called Revelation and the End of All Things by an expert in this field called Craig R. Kuster. And I'm going to read this for us. He says the progression of the plot continues to follow shorter cycles of visions that convey warnings and promises of blessing. But the overall sequence of events is highly stylized and can be outlined as follows. In Revelation 12, you find Satan thrown from heaven to earth. Then you find the beast and the false prophet conquer. Then you find the harlot rides on the beast. And then suddenly everything happens in reverse order from Revelation 17 to verse 20. So this outline, it shows that John, in writing this, he systematically introduces Satan, the beast, and the false prophet, and finally the harlot into the drama. And then in reverse order, he describes the defeats of the harlot, the beast, and the false prophet, and finally Satan himself. The last piece in the sequence occurs almost as an anticlimax when the devil is momentarily released, only to be cast into the lake of fire. You know, sometimes when you read the text on its own, it is difficult to imagine such an overall structure, but it is really worth it just to step back and view it as a whole. And sometimes it starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that it's not just a bunch of disjointed images and visions, but there is actually a sequence. Now, for some of you might be interested in this part, the historical context. This is a a history of the Roman Empire from around 70 or 80 BC to well, almost to 100 AD, and it's quite a complex story. The first thing to realize is that Augustus, and I'm just giving this as historical background, was the first emperor. Julius Caesar was not the first emperor of the Roman Empire, although he's certainly the most famous. The Roman Empire only came into being in 31 BC. He was the leader of a Roman Republic. Then you'll realize after Nero's death, which was self-inflicted, where he stuck a knife into his throat, it became very messy. You can see some of these emperors reigned for a very short period, some only for a few months. So you can imagine when you try and count the number of emperors, it gets quite complex. Who was actually in charge after 68 AD is a bit contentious. They weren't truly consecutive, they actually overlapped. And I'll explain now why that is important. Because it all ties into a burning question a lot of people have, is when was Revelation written? Well, Irenaeus, who lived around AD 180, was a student of Polycarp, who himself was a disciple of the Apostle John. He wrote that the apocalyptic vision was seen not very long ago, almost in our own generation, at the close of the reign of Domitian. Now, in the previous slide, let's just see when that was. Domitian was just before the end of the first century, so 100 AD would be roughly here. And just talk about the slide again, just to locate ourselves. You didn't pick it up. Jesus was born during the reign of Augustus. He was crucified during the reign of Tiberius and resurrected during the time of Tiberius, and the temple was destroyed in the time of Emperor Vespasian. Now we know that Domitian died in the year 96 historically, so we've got a pretty good idea that the book of Revelation was written somewhere before in the 90s, let's say that. If we look at the church fathers as well, Clement of Alexandria and Eusebius, they identified the tyrant in the book of Revelation, the beast, in other words, as Domitian. Now, a lot of people today would find that difficult to believe because they view Nero as the great persecutor, and historically that is correct, but throughout church history until very recently, it was generally understood that it was written during the reign of Domitian, during a time of renewed persecution. And let's talk about one of the important timing passages that occur in the Bible. And the question is it indeed a timing passage? In Revelation 17, verse 8 to 11, and this is a highly contested verse, it says, "The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come." This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is. The other has not yet come, but when it does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. This is quite a tongue twister, and people have been speculating about this passage for a long time. And I'm not going to today give you a definitive answer, because even in our own church, we don't take a specific particular position on this. What we do know is this illusion that I've highlighted there. The one who once was, now is not, and yet will come, was probably a reference to Emperor Nero, who persecuted the church in the most brutal way. And up to around 80 AD, a lot of people, and beyond that, still did not believe that he had actually died. They thought that he was in the Parthian Empire and that he was going to come with the Parthian warriors and he was going to reinstitute oppression of the Christians. So a lot of scholars do believe that this is a reference to the myth called Nero Redivivus. In other words, Nero who came to life again. There was an expectation that if this was not Nero himself who would come, this would be someone as if Nero was still alive, someone just as bad. And there is some historical evidence that shows that Domitian also, through emperor worship that he instituted, oppressed the Christians. But let's look at this passage. 5 have fallen, one is not, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain only for a little while. And I'm going to just introduce 2 popular possibilities, and you can make your own mind up. If we look at that picture I showed you before, and if we decide that, well, we cannot just decide, but if we decide to start our numbering at Augustus, assuming that these kings referred to emperors, then we would start at Augustus, and then Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, which would mean that the one that is would be Vespasian. The other one that has not yet come, but when he comes, must remain for only a short while. Well, that seems to fit, because Titus was only there for a short while. And then the beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. So that predicts that Domitian will again persecute the church. But there's a problem with this. What about Galba, Otho, and Vitellius? They were also emperors. So you see, the moment you start introducing those, then which one of those might be the one that is? And how does that fit in with the one that's only there for a short while? Or maybe Galba was the one who was, and maybe Otho was the one that will only be there for a short while. We just don't have enough information to make that decision. Another possibility is, if we view from the Christian's perspective, that Julius Caesar was also a king, although he was not the emperor of the Roman Empire. Well, he didn't have to be for this timeline to work. We can start numbering at Julius Caesar. And we can say the 5 that have fallen are Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. And then the one that is Nero. The beast that once was and now is not is an 8th king, is Vespasian. And the one who has not yet come will only remain for a little while was Galba. Now, I don't know what happened to Otho and Vitellius again in this timeline, but it's generally acknowledged by scholars that it's actually impossible to make a definitive stance. Yet many churches do that to try and explain. And they use this passage to explain how the entire book of Revelation might have been written before the destruction of Jerusalem and refers to the reign of Nero only. Now, you might think, is this important? I don't think it's important for the overall book of Revelation, because it doesn't really have reference to our lives today and how do we apply it to our own lives. I'm just giving this to you as background, because you'll very often discover advanced discussions on this king came and then that king came. I'm just telling you straight today, it's not that simple, and there are arguments either way, and nothing really fits. There's a third possibility, that these were just figurative ways of describing progressions of kings. There are other times where you find in ancient literature where they talk about a perfect sequence of 10 kings, almost like you talk about in Daniel, a perfect sequence of 4 empires. There have been many more empires, but for the purposes of the book of Daniel, there were 4 empires. And so it might again just have symbolic significance. But I'm just giving this to you as background. You can, afterwards, you can go through these and make up your own mind. But a serious option is that the Revelation was written to remind a suffering and battered church that Christ was Lord. So beyond all dating issues and as some people have said, it's purely to encourage the church that is being persecuted. When we read the first few letters, we find some references to persecution in the book of Revelation, but the overall focus is a reminder that Christ is the Lamb, that Christ was Lord. And yes, John does seem to address martyrs throughout the book in Revelation 6 verse 9, 7, 14, and 12 verse 11. Now, a very modern understanding of apocalyptic. This is from a book by Robert Jensen called We Are All Apocalyptic Now, on the responsibilities of teaching, preaching, reporting, writing, and speaking out. Now, Robert Jensen is an atheist. This is not a theological book, but it is still very interesting what he says. He says, given the severity of the human assault on the ecosphere, compounded by the suffering and strife within the human family, honest apocalyptic thinking that is firmly grounded in a systematic evaluation of the state of the world is not only sensible, but a moral obligation. Things are bad, systems are failing, and the status quo won't last forever. His words describe many of the popular movies that we've seen at cinemas in recent years, and also describes the way that the word apocalyptic has been hijacked by the world, as if apocalyptic just means the end of all things. Yet in our very first slide, we spoke about that. Apocalypse means revelation, and it's a revelation of Jesus, and it's good news. You see, Robert Jensen does not have an intervention by God in view. He rather believes that human society will self-destruct in the near future. He argues that apocalyptic thinking ought to involve dealing with reality and holding on to our humanity when the current systems collapse. In other words, the only ones who can save us are ourselves. But Christian apocalyptic thinking, on the other hand, is profoundly hopeful. God himself will intervene in history. Jesus will return, and there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation gives us assurance about the final outcome of all things. Thank you.